You hear the grinding first, stone against bone, methodical, precise, the kind of sound that shouldn't exist in a palace courtyard at dawn, but does. A woman kneels in the dust, hands bound behind her, while a physician with steady fingers measures the angle of her jawbone. He's calculating, not how to heal, how to break in a way that will heal wrong, so that when she opens her mouth to speak, to plead, to scream her innocence, the sound that emerges will be something between a wheeze and a moan, something that will make children hide behind their mothers when she passes, something that will remind everyone who sees her. This is what happens when your bloodline threatens an empire. She hasn't murdered anyone. She hasn't plotted rebellion. She was born a princess in the wrong kingdom at the wrong time. Before we go any further, I'm genuinely curious. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching this from. It amazes me that stories like this one, buried for millennia, now reach every corner of the globe. This is ancient Assyria, between 911 and 609 BCE, the greatest military power Mesopotamia had ever seen. An empire that didn't just conquer territory, it conquered the human imagination itself. And in the clay tablet archives of Nineveh and Kala, preserved beneath ash and rubble, archaeologists discovered something that made them pause. Not battle records, not tax receipts. Detailed instructions for how to transform a woman into a living warning. Medical procedures, timelines, psychological techniques written down by palace scribes as casually as cooking recipes. The Assyrians weren't just inflicting punishment, they were perfecting it, documenting it, creating a methodology that would outlive their empire by centuries. But here's what the tablets don't fully capture. What some of these women did with their suffering, how they hid their own testimonies in the cracks of the very palaces meant to erase them, how they survived not just the punishment itself, but the world that came after. The woman in the courtyard had a name before she arrived in Assyria, Ilani, daughter of a king in Elam, a neighboring empire that periodically challenged Assyrian authority. When her father's rebellion collapsed, she was handed over as part of the peace settlement, not killed, not ransomed, transferred, like a document proving a transaction had been completed. The Assyrian court received her in silence. No chains, no violence, just priests who bathed her, fed her well, gave her rooms in the palace. For 3 weeks, she lived in a state of suspended dread, waiting for whatever punishment would come. And that waiting, that's already part of the design. Because the Assyrians understood something that would take modern psychology millennia to articulate. Anticipation of suffering can be worse than suffering itself. The mind, left to imagine horrors, creates them more vividly than reality ever could. When the transformation began, it started with her external identity. The jewelry that marked her as royalty was removed one piece at a time over 3 months. Not stolen, carefully catalogued. Her hair, which had been arranged in the elaborate style of Elamite nobility, was shorn weekly by the same palace barber. The same day, the same time, the same room. Routine is a weapon. If something terrible happens once, it's trauma. If it happens every Wednesday at dawn, it becomes a law of nature. Your mind stops resisting. It starts preparing. It begins to cooperate with its own destruction. But this was only preparation. The real work required surgeons. One morning, Eleni was brought to a chamber where physicians waited with bronze instruments and clay models of human skulls. They didn't explain what would happen. They simply held her down and broke her nose at a precise angle, then set it incorrectly so it would heal crooked. They monitored the healing process daily, applying salves to prevent infection, because she needed to survive this. She needed to survive healthy. After the bone healed, they tattooed her face. Not decorative patterns, administrative symbols. Marks that identified her in Akkadian script as someone who had belonged to a fallen house. Someone who had resisted every time she saw her reflection in polished bronze. She was reading her own biography written into her flesh in a language she hadn't been taught to read. And here's what makes this different from simple brutality. She was then given rooms adjacent to the throne room, fed well, bathed, dressed in clothes that were almost, but not quite, as fine as what she'd worn before. Close enough to remind her, different enough to mark the distance. Because she wasn't being hidden away, she was being displayed. Foreign ambassadors arriving at the Assyrian court would be escorted past her chambers, specifically to see her. No words were exchanged, no explanations given. The image itself was the message. Historian Mario Liverani calls this the weaponization of the body, not as an instrument of war, but of diplomacy. Every scar, every healed fracture was a paragraph in a letter written to foreign kings. Choose your alliances carefully, but Eleni was just one woman. The system was much larger. In 642 BCE, when King Ashurbanipal conquered Susa, the capital of Elam, he captured the entire royal family, 4 daughters of King Toman. They had never held swords, never made political decisions. Their crime was biological. They carried royal blood that legitimized a rival dynasty. What happened next is documented so extensively in palace reliefs and written records that we can reconstruct not just the actions, but the philosophy behind them. The 4 sisters were separated immediately, housed in different wings of the palace. This wasn't security, they were women in the heart of enemy territory. It was designed to prevent conversation, to eliminate the possibility that they might maintain their collective identity through shared memory and language. If one sister can't confirm to another, yes, we are still sisters, the bonds begin to dissolve. They were given new names, not insulting names, administratively neutral designations, numbers, essentially. Because identity isn't just social, it's linguistic. The moment your name stops being used, a part of your consciousness fragments. Then came what palace records call the reconfiguration of form. For 6 months, specialists worked on these women, surgeons, tattoo artists, craftspeople who normally created royal monuments. Their hair was removed entirely and prevented from regrowth through regular applications of a caustic salve that scarred the scalp. In Mesopotamian culture, a woman's hair wasn't decoration, it was an identifying feature. These women would never be recognizable in that way again. Their shoulders were tattooed with patterns identical to those used on livestock. The message was unambiguous. You have been recategorized. Their feet were bound using techniques borrowed from other cultures but refined for Assyrian purposes. The binding didn't cripple them. They could walk, but it introduced chronic low-level pain into every step. Pain became the baseline. Any moment without pain would start to feel like an absence rather than a natural state, and they were displayed regularly in the palace's public spaces. The stone reliefs that survive in museums today, fragments excavated in the 19th century, capture something the written records don't quite manage. The absolute stillness of people who have learned that movement draws attention, and attention brings consequences. Their expressions, carved in stone, are blank, not peaceful, blank. The absence of expression as a survival strategy learned through months of conditioning. But perhaps the most systematically cruel innovation was something called the 1,000-day dissolution. This was applied to women who had committed what Assyrians considered the ultimate crime. Maintaining loyalty to their birth family Rather than accepting Assyrian authority as final, the process began in a public square, usually in a city near the woman's homeland where news would travel fastest. She would be displayed unclothed, not for sexual violation, but for complete erasure of dignity. Her former titles would be read aloud by scribes, then deliberately struck from official stone inscriptions as crowds watched. Each erasure was ceremonial, deliberate. Then came the sustained portion. For exactly 1,000 days, the specificity appears in multiple sources. The woman would rotate through 3 tasks. One day, she would clean the palace latrines, crawling into spaces beneath floors where waste accumulated. The smell alone, extended over hours, was a form of torture that left no visible marks. Another day, the tanning yards, working vats filled with caustic urine and lime, hands bleeding, caustic entering through wounds, fingernails eventually falling away. Continue working or face worse. Another day, spreading human waste from the latrines as fertilizer in fields, visible to everyone wearing clothes dyed with cheap pigments that resembled the royal purple she might once have worn. The resemblance was deliberate. Everyone watching understood this is what used to be royalty. Medical attention was provided throughout. If infection threatened, plant-based treatments were applied. If she became pregnant, and some did herbs, terminated it, then back to work. The goal was punishment that could be extended indefinitely. Her body had to remain functional for suffering. And then came day 1001. She was released, not freed. Released like a tool no longer needed. Given back her name officially, though no one recognized it anymore. Given documents confirming her former status, though worthless now. Given provisions for a month and sent out. The palace records don't document what happened next, but fragmentary Babylonian accounts from later periods, recording second-hand information from refugees, describe the aftermath. No city would accept her. No family would acknowledge her. She carried a smell that treatments couldn't fully remove. Her appearance had been fundamentally altered. Her hands no longer looked quite human. Some of these women ended up in wilderness. Some were taken by those who saw them as already compromised, exploitable without social consequence. Some formed small communities with other survivors, enclaves of women systematically unmade by empire, learning how to exist in that unmaking. She had been punished. She had survived the punishment. And the world itself had been reconfigured so that her survival was irrelevant. She had been made a ghost while still alive. A ghost with a body that required food, experienced pain, carried memories no one would listen to. But here's what makes studying Assyrian practices particularly haunting. They kept meticulous records. They didn't just inflict these punishments, they documented them. Created an archive. They wanted future Assyrian governors to understand the exact procedures, the exact timelines, the exact psychological mechanisms that made these practices effective. One tablet from King Arcane, II's reign, describes in clinical language the reconstruction of a captive's face following intentional fracture. The tone isn't cruel, it's professional. It notes that the fracture should be set to look like it healed incorrectly naturally, so the woman herself might not fully understand it had been engineered. The ambiguity about whether her suffering was purposeful or accidental would add psychological dimension. Had she done something to deserve this, or had she simply been unlucky? The uncertainty itself becomes punishment. This documentation served a purpose beyond record-keeping. By writing these procedures down, by storing them in palace archives, the Assyrians were creating a manual, institutional knowledge that would survive changes in leadership. A how-to guide for managing conquered populations through fear that targets the mind more than the body. And the content of these archives made an impact on surrounding empires. When Babylon later absorbed Assyrian territory, Babylonian rulers studied these methods. They didn't copy them exactly, but the principles spread. The idea that punishment could be extended, psychological, designed to produce a living warning, these concepts infected later imperial practices. In 612 BCE, the Neo-Assyrian Empire collapsed. Nineveh was sacked by Medes and Babylonians. Palaces systematically destroyed. Soldiers smashed statues, threw tablets into rubble, set fires. In the chaos, the women held in the palace, though still alive, simply left. What archaeologists found over a century later was unexpected. Scattered throughout palace rubble, usually in crevices or hidden beneath fallen stones, were small clay tablets, not official documents. These were crude, hasty, clearly written by untrained hands, some barely larger than a fingernail. Written in Aramaic, not the official Akkadian script, meaning they were written by people without access to formal scribal training, people who shouldn't have been writing at all. The content, when deciphered, was unmistakable. Personal testimonies. One tablet roughly translated, "They call me nobody. My hands are no longer mine, but I was here. I existed. I will leave this mark so someone will know." Another, "My sisters were taken to separate rooms. I never saw them again. I called until my voice disappeared. They said, 'The gods abandoned me.' I think the gods couldn't bear to listen." Another, barely legible, "The scars on my back spell symbols I cannot read. They told me what they mean. I don't believe them. I will decide what they mean." These weren't written expecting to be found. The women who wrote them had no reason to believe anyone would discover them, much less read them. They were creating witnesses to their own existence, insisting in the only way they could that what happened to them was real and mattered. Historian Stephanie Daly, who has studied these fragments extensively, argues they represent some of the earliest documented evidence of testimony as resistance, not violent resistance. Existential resistance, the refusal to disappear completely. What's remarkable is how these women subverted the very language of their oppression. The Assyrians had tattooed symbols on their bodies as marks of slavery. In some tablets, we see women reframing these scars as battle wounds, badges of survival rather than defeat. One woman wrote, "They broke my hands. Now I write with my broken hands. Let that be the record of what I survived." She's not writing despite her broken hands. She's writing with them. The breaks are part of the signature, part of the message. Evidence of something other than defeat. The physical evidence exists in multiple forms. In 2003, forensic anthropologists examining remains from mass graves near Kala identified bone fractures consistent with descriptions in palace records. Precise surgical fractures healed in specific ways. The evidence was there in calcified bone. This had been done deliberately, repeatedly, on multiple individuals. The palace reliefs themselves are anatomically accurate representations of specific injuries. Artists weren't idealizing, they were documenting, creating stone records of specific cases, monuments to suffering. The Assyrian court was saying to anyone who saw these walls, "This happened, and it can happen again." The existential horror isn't just the punishment, it's the public acknowledgement of it. The empire's willingness to memorialize cruelty, to create permanent records, to ensure everyone knew this was possible. Everything was visible. Everything acknowledged. and that visibility itself was part of the punishment. But what fascinates scholars most is the psychological sophistication. These weren't crude torturers. These were administrators who understood that suffering operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Physical level, the body is harmed. Social level, the woman becomes a visible example, always observed, always knowing she's observed. Temporal level, she knows her punishment has an endpoint, but also knows that endpoint doesn't mean freedom. Knowing that survival produces only a different form of suffering is its own psychological torture. Epistemic level, she's told she deserves this, that her family's resistance justified it, that the gods abandoned her, that she's no longer fully human. In an environment where there's no contradictory narrative, where everyone reinforces these stories, they begin to calcify into something like truth. She begins to believe them, and that belief is perhaps the cruelest punishment, because it means even if she escapes, her sense of self has been fundamentally altered. The fall of Nineveh didn't immediately end these practices. Other empires had learned and adapted. But when you destroy a capital, burn the palaces, scatter the administrators, the continuity of institutional practice becomes harder to maintain. The women who survived and formed small communities outside the destroyed cities slowly began to reconstruct a collective narrative. They were no longer isolated individuals, burdened by guilt, but voices within a shared story. Together, they rewrote what had been imposed upon them. In this new story, what happened to them was not justified. Their survival was not shame, but defiance. The perpetrators were not gods, they were men who could be defeated. Over time, some of these women re-entered settled society, though they always remained on the margins liminal figures. They became merchants, healers, and priestesses in temples devoted to goddesses of healing and resurrection. Their suffering was not erased, but transformed. Within a new framework, their endurance became a source of power. Their scars were not symbols of disgrace, but of strength. Later, Mesopotamian literature remembered them as wise women, those whose knowledge came from enduring unspeakable cruelty. People sought their counsel precisely because they had seen the machinery of empire and survived with clarity enough to imagine alternatives. In the deserts of Iraq today, where Nineveh's ruins still stand, local Bedouins tell stories about the wind that whistles through broken columns. They say you can hear voices. Scholars dismiss this as myth, but what if it is cultural memory and inherited echo of collective trauma? Perhaps the land itself remembers that something terrible once happened there. The women punished by the Assyrians are long dead. Their bones have turned to dust, their names erased. Yet traces remain: clay tablets, marks on walls, fragments of stories. The memory endures that empires can be instruments of horror and cruelty can become ordinary policy. The Assyrians were not unique, they were a pattern. Their system refined suffering into an administrative tool. Yet the women refused disappearance. Through records, rituals, and sheer survival, they insisted on existence. Their defiance still whispers through time, reminding us of human resilience and warning what happens when power goes unchecked.